Hello there. Today I want to talk about the absolute state of my country, Canada, and I'm glad you could join me to do that. I'm going to be talking specifically about the very confused and bizarre political situation here, which is at least confusing and bizarre to me, and I think probably to a lot of other people, especially if they hear about it. Here in Canada, we have a very reactive political cycle, and what I mean by that is we're seemingly beholden to the news cycle and to whatever kind of happens in the world at that moment, which maybe sounds obvious or like something that would be the case in many countries, but I feel like we have a very unique situation here in the way Canadians react. So, Canada just got out of a decade plus long government under Justin Trudeau, who by the end of his term, his last term, was a ridiculously unpopular man, and by most accounts, by the majority of Canadians' opinions, a failed prime minister. He didn't deliver on what he promised. His famous sunny ways ended up being very cloudy. The cost of living skyrocketed under his leadership. That means the cost of housing, the cost of groceries, the cost of gas, etc. Political division skyrocketed. He was a very divisive leader. And just most Canadians, I get the impression, would say that things just got worse under him. And honestly, in the lead up to the last election, that wasn't even really a partisan opinion. He was unpopular within his own party. Well, that led to a very expected downturn in the Liberal Party of Canada's, his party's election outlook leading to the last federal election. And things were looking like the Liberals were about to have a turn either as the minority party, because the other party, the NDP, performed gigabad. I mean, they got massacred. So the Liberals were looking to be the likely minority party, with the Conservatives under Pierre Poilievre being the majority party. That was until the president of the country to the south of us, the United States, Donald Trump, made a statement. Just something as simple as that. So Donald Trump, in his typical kind of style, said something a little provocative. I mean, very provocative, especially in the Canadian context, which were things to the effect of Canada should be the 51st state in America. Canada is not like a functional country, or like we overly rely on America. And then he even made some statements saying we are somehow a major security threat to America. So these are obviously things that are, it wouldn't take a scholar to know these are things that are going to make Canadians unhappy. They're not sentiments that the majority of Canadians share. And so magically, pretty much overnight, the prognosis for the Liberal Party of Canada went from defeat to what it was, which was a victory. The most unremarkable man in Canadian political history, just about, Mark Carney, who kind of came in through the side and hadn't been a major figure in our public imagination up until that point, soared to victory on the back of the words of a foreign country's president. And that's what I mean by this reactivity. So ultimately, I do disagree with what Donald Trump said. And I think, again, it doesn't take a genius to know that most Canadians would not be happy with that statement. But I'm shocked and not very happy with how reactive Canada was to it. Now, that's not a universal experience. This has been taken, like many things, very partisanly. So the left here is, especially when it comes to the topic of American influence, has a very strong nationalistic bent to it. This is something that can kind of differentiate Canada from some Western countries. It's not a universal rule. Obviously, like I said, Canada is one of these, but usually leftist parties are not super nationalistic. And in many ways, our left is not, but again, when it comes to America, they are. However, if it's on the topic of immigration, traditionally the left here will say they're for large amounts of it, and that to be a Canadian, all you have to do is come here and basically, honestly, like kind of reside here, and then you're full on Canadian. Like that's kind of the left idea of what it means to be a Canadian, is just to move to Canada and then like exist in Canada for a period of time, and then you're Canadian. That's kind of not nationalistic, but then on things like this, they're all of a sudden waving the Canadian flag. There's this whole campaign that the Liberal Party kind of played into, which was like the elbows up campaign, which comes from hockey. This idea that you want to keep your elbow up in hockey when you're doing your stick play and guard your area. So Canadians were encouraged to be elbows up and to guard ourselves from America, all because of these terms. And the tariff war. Tariff war can't be understated as well. But in Canadian public consciousness, given that most people don't understand what tariffs are or how like government finances work or trade, it's pretty clear that a lot of the furor came from Donald Trump's terms and the things he said. And what's been weird is the way not only they've reacted, the way that this has been such a major issue or thing in the minds of maybe more left-leaning Canadians. It's also been weird to see how our political right has reacted, which I was just talking about how in most countries the left is not very nationalistic. Well, in most countries, the right tends to be more so, fair to say. At least they'll be the home of nationalists. Like if there's a nationalist party, tends to be on the right. Internationally, there's a few examples where that is not the case. I mean, you could say the government of China is a nominally leftist party or organization that is highly nationalistic. And then like in the post-Soviet Russian context, you have some movements like that, like the kind of very bizarre and hard to understand movement of National Bolshevism and things like that. Well, anyways, here on the right, unlike what's traditional, because of everything going on and how the liberals and the left has been perceived to kind of be the champion of this elbows up, keep Canada Canadian movement, we now have a situation where the right is seemingly taking on a very cynical, at times almost anti-Canadian kind of tone, viewing our country as like a failed nation, really just constantly kind of talking about how shitty Canada is in general, and really ragging on it. So that's bizarre, because even a couple years ago, let's say during the lockdowns, when everyone was forced inside, we had a internationally known protest here, the trucker protest, where eventually some people had had enough, and some of those people had big-ass trucks, and they got in them and made a caravan and went to Ottawa, honked a lot, caused a little bit of a upset. And during that time, the trucker protest was very much waving the Canadian flags. And I vividly remember news articles and people saying, oh, you know, it just sucks knowing I can't fly a Canadian flag now because these truckers have ruined it. And it was usually more left-leaning people who were upset with the truckers. Well, that switched in all the space of a few years, and now the Canadian flag is the elbows up flag, and the Conservatives, nominally, are the ones who are kind of ragging on Canada. This all goes into how reactive we are. And nowhere is this kind of more clearly shown, I think, than the, not recent emergence, they've been around for a few years, but the recent upsurgence of the Alberta separatists movement. If you don't know, Alberta is a very conservative province, traditionally, outside of Calgary and Edmonton, major cities who, like major cities in most Western nations, tend to vote more left. Alberta tends to be pretty right-wing, and that kind of comes with a whole traditional Canadian right-wing culture. There's a lot of like hunting, fishing, outdoors types, self-sufficiency, all that kind of stuff. And because of this recent election, where because of the comments of a foreign president that ultimately is not our president, prime minister, and doesn't have actual direct power in our country, so therefore, one, he has the right to say what he wants, right? And then two, we have our own country with our own house to keep in order, and his words ultimately manifest to nothing if we don't let them. They're just words, you know? It's not like he can speak our nation into being not a nation anymore. Because of the Liberal government being here, again, which is a shock to many of us. And by the way, if you look at that, that's a very generationally split thing. People my age and a little bit older and younger overall didn't react to this like that. Polling that showed the reasons for people's voting intentions showed that it was Gen X and the boomers who, in Canada, their main voting intention was to stick it to Donald Trump, which is something. I can't even get started on that. And then the younger you go, the more it becomes more tangible issues that affect Canadians, like cost of living, housing, immigration. So Yeah, anyways, I just want to say that it is a bit of a generational divide on that. But in Alberta, part of the reaction to this terrible situation where all of a sudden we have the least popular party somehow surging to popularity again and getting elected, is that the Alberta separatist movement is gaining a lot of steam, getting a lot of energy put into it, and gaining a lot of adherents. And this is such a confusing issue because even the leader of Canada's ostensibly most right-wing major party, major meaning they do at least consistently get 1+% of the votes. At one point they got like 5%. So the leader of the People's Party of Canada, Maxime Bernier, former Conservative MP, he is in support of the Alberta referendum and to a degree the Alberta separatist movement. Now he frames it in like federal tyranny versus provincial autonomy. The People's Party is libertarian, or they have a big libertarian streak. And so you have that situation in our country where the right wing is now the wing that is somehow seemingly less for the nation and more for division, which is very confusing, and that changes very quickly. And I do want to clarify, like, I don't think Maxime is for dissolution, but he's at least representing the issue in a positive light, which in most countries, the right wing would not be for any form of dissolution or separation or anything like that. So that's just really confusing. I find it confusing, and I think it could all change again tomorrow if something changed tomorrow. But now you have these Alberta separatists who, because of the way the election went, think they're so different from the majority of Canada. They perceive a lot of them, Canada, as being somehow very liberal, even though if you look, the Conservatives got the popular vote last election. And even if you look at like Ontario, which is often associated with being very liberal, once you leave Toronto, Niagara Falls, St. Catharines, major cities, you find that it's all blue, except for some Indigenous communities in Northern Ontario, which went NDP. It's all blue. And that same logic applies to BC, considered very liberal by a lot of people who aren't from British Columbia. Yet once you leave the major cities and the more urban areas, just about all blue. So these Alberta Conservatives have grievance with our current government and perceive themselves as being so different because of the votes of major cities in Canada. And they share that grievance with Conservatives across the nation, but they're now threatening or intending to leave, take that very conservative province out of our country, thus, as a side effect, making it very unlikely if they ever did that, which is doubtworthy that they'll be able to do this, that Conservatives would never get elected again because they'll lose a huge amount of traditional, safe Conservative territory. And they want to leave in either, there's kind of like two camps, it seems, in the Alberta separatist movement, which is the leave and be a nation, or leave and be the 51st state of America, attempt to join. I think both are very interesting in the Canadian context and very unprecedented as concepts. I think these people have a very different idea of what makes a nation from me, and I find it mind-boggling. So Alberta shares language with the majority of our country. 90%-ish of Canada are Anglophone. They share culture with rural Canadians the country over. They often talk and think as if Alberta has this unique, like, unreplicable culture that the rest of the country just can never understand. Meanwhile, I grew up hunting, fishing, with a grandfather who was self-sufficient, ran his own businesses, and hated whenever the government would interfere in anything he did, right? So he would fit in just fine in Alberta, yet he's Ontarian. And that kind of culture, that kind of concept exists across Canada. And what's even kind of funnier about this is I also oppose Quebec separating. So Quebec is traditionally our big separatist province with the movement within it of people who want to leave, a significant amount of them. I'm not a fan of that either. I'm fair in that sense, but I think if you compare the two of them, it's hard to directly equate them because the genesis of Quebec is that they predate Canada as a British possession and nation. New France was here before. It was conquered by Britain and handed over after the 7 Years' War to the shock of the Quebecois at the time. A lot of them were so surprised that when the British came and said, guess what, France gave you to us, a lot of them were like, oh no, no way. Turns out they did. And that genesis of being like a pre-existing and also having that grievance, that like unique experience of a felt betrayal by their mother country, and then being quickly integrated into a country that just recently was their enemy, creates a sort of like an ethnogenesis. They have a language, they have a shared origin, and they have differentiated in their history from both their mother country and the country they integrated into since then. So though I don't support the separation, I think it'd be a terrible thing, there's at least there's like a sense to it. I won't call it a legitimacy, but there's a sense. Alberta, to contrast, was settled very recently, and it was settled with the express purpose of keeping the West Canadian. So it was very sparse frontier, there wasn't a lot of people there, and there was a great concern in Canadian conservatism that Americans would beat Canadians to that settlement. And then all of a sudden you'd have this situation where, you know, there's a British colony, the British Columbians over there, there's northern and there's lower and upper Canada over in the east, and then the Americans would just kind of wedge up and have a holding cutting them off from each other, and Canada would never formulate or manifest as a unified nation going across from sea to sea. So in order to keep Canada Canadian, keep the West Canadian, people were sent out there. The RCMP was, this is a big part of the RCMP's formation, was sent out there to protect and settle the West. So that's the origin of Alberta. And you can see how different that is from the origin of Quebec and the origin really of separatist movements all over the world. I mean, there's more than I could ever name, but whether it's Scotland, whether it's when Ireland was part of the UK and had a separatist movement, Hong Kong, Catalonia, in all of these cases, you have situations where cultures predate the current larger formation. They often have a language. There's like key core differences between them and the larger whole. That adds a sort of sense to why they want to, some of them, have more independence, more autonomy, or even separate. I find this all, it's like feeling politically homeless almost, because I really think Canadians are, maybe like it's a lack of political education or a lack of national feeling or just being so divided and so online. But it feels like a really quite nonsensical political makeup right now, where the left is behaving kind of in some ways like the old right, like, you know, John A. Macdonald, the old flag, the old country, keep Canada Canadian. And then the right is like, Canada's a shithole, this place sucks, can't believe the Liberals got elected again, I hate Canada, screw Canada. Very bizarre. To me, a nation is never so cheap. My nation would never be so cheap as a couple of governments, a couple of policies, a couple of grievances making me hate it, denigrate it, even speak a word of sedition, dissolving. It actually boggles my mind that there are so many people in Alberta who seemingly have no connection to Canada, or so little of a connection or bond with Canada or the idea of Canada, that because of the control of oil, some grievances with the government, and some political things, they would be so quick to desire separating from us. My family has 4 generations of service to Canada through the armed forces. To me, Canada is a real thing. I'm proud to be Canadian. And to me, that doesn't mean hating America or defining myself by not being American. It means I'm proud of the guys who went up on Vimy Ridge and who are buried in foreign fields with Canadian maple leafs on their headstones. I'm proud of the Canadians who served in Afghanistan and those who unfortunately passed there, including Albertans who, those Albertan soldiers in Afghanistan would have had Canadian flags draped over their coffins at the ramp ceremonies and would have been buried back here in Canadian soil, again, with the maple leaf on their gravestones. I don't think the nation is mine to dissolve or destroy. It's an inheritance, and it's an agreement between former generations and future generations and us, and we have a responsibility to both those who came before and those who came after to keep it and to fight for it. And that includes internally fighting for a better country, fighting within the system we have for the things we want. I think it's very true that Alberta is not getting a fair shake. I think Alberta deserves more. I think it's a shame the way our oil is being held back by partisan politics. I think there's a lot that could improve and should improve for Alberta. But the idea that that can be best achieved by leaving Canada is really insane to me. And it's a shame. And I just can't believe, yeah, people have never apparently sung the Canadian national anthem with pride in their heart, never felt a sense of belonging to our wider community, and never felt pride, it seems, for what Canada is and what it could be. I'm very disconnected from that, and I'm glad that I am, because I love Canada, and I'm proud of my nation, and I really hope that this referendum coming up fails. I think it will. I think there's a silent majority of Albertans who are going to agree with me that, you know, being Canadian is pretty rad, and that a few grievances, a few governments, a few policies is not enough to throw your flag in the garbage. And yeah, I hope Canada can develop a sense, you know, there's one way where I'm for separation, and it's separation of Canadian political thought and mindsets from what Americans do. America's a sovereign nation. They have the right to elect a Republican government. Their Republican president has the right to say whatever he wants. He has the right to do policy things in America, put tariffs on countries, do whatever. And if that's what his polity wants, and if he is popular for doing that in the United States, then by the very definition of it, he's doing what he's supposed to do, representing his people who voted for him. And we should think higher of ourselves and have more backbone and be able to say, yes, what Trump said obviously is not in line with Canadian feeling, but that doesn't mean we don't vote for our issues and for a better Canada within our country. I think it's insane that we have this government again, and that it really happened overnight, them being pretty much unelectable to them being our government yet again, just because of the words of a foreign leader. So we do need separation in that sense. And we need to learn how to be proud of being Canadian without hating America too. I'm not for this elbows up, screw America, don't buy American. Listen, the trade war is complex, and I get that it's hurting businesses, but there's also a factor where our own government is failing us in that trade war. And part of them failing us in that trade war is that they're not really motivated to deliver results, because their voting bloc wants them to stick it to Trump, which, because of the lack of public education on how tariffs work and trade wars and economy and all that, they're more interested in displays of disliking America and displays of saying F you, which means that's the incentive, is to just kind of not make peace, not be amenable to working with the American government. And that's how they're going to behave. And so they don't have an incentive to deliver better quality of living, to work with the American government to figure out some kind of compromise, because that would be viewed as weak, and that wouldn't stick it to Trump, because the best way to stick it to Trump is to somehow weaken Canada. None of it makes sense, and it would be hilarious if it wasn't so real and actually affecting people's lives. But that's a little bit of why Canada is a mess and a little bit of my views on it. I'm getting a little warm because it's so sunny, so beautiful, so I'm going to cut it short here. But thank you for watching. I really appreciate it, and I hope to see you on the next one.